Good morning. Good morning. And welcome to the November 18th meeting of the Coronado Roundtable, which I'm calling to order. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. Please be seated. It's what a nice crowd. It's great to see everyone. We appreciate your attendance, and we also appreciate your $2 contributions for coffee, because that's what funds this organization. Basically, I want to just thank you so much for being here and for your continued interest in what we hope is a wide range of interesting programs throughout the year. According to the bylaws of this organization, I am required to give a brief annual report at the November meeting. Believe me, this is going to be short. Beginning in January, the Coronado Roundtable will have a new president. Christian Escoven, please rise. Thank you for the fine welcome. As you know, Christian, for 30 years, Christian was the head librarian here at the Coronado Public Library. He oversaw the renovation of the building and the remarkable installation of the Ramos Martinez fresco murals. That in itself was a great task. Thank you very much, and another round of applause to welcome. Mike Napolitano, please rise. He's the executive secretary of this organization. In other words, he's the guy that makes sure our train runs on time. Thank you, Mike. Our treasurer, Darlene Martolio, is not here today, but counting our officers, we have 13 board members and 7 emeritus board members, with everyone pulling their weight throughout the year. Will the members of the board of directors please rise? Thank you very much. And Jim Kelly, I'm going to ask you to remain standing. Please rise. Today is Jim's birthday. I don't know the number, but the first number is 9. Thank you very much.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Well, that's great. As you know, Jim has served for years and years on this organization's board, and as in his spare time, he has a weekly column in the Eagle Journal, and on a monthly basis, when he's able to attend these meetings, he writes up a write-up of this program and submits it to the newspaper. Jim, thank you so much for your service. Let's talk about money for a little bit. We appreciate your $2 contributions to fund this organization. Presently, we have $1,594 in the bank. In January, we're going to give this check to the library, $500 check. So we'll start the year with about $1,000 in our bank account, and that's what it takes to keep it running. This concludes the annual report. Unless there's are there any questions? No. Okay, question.
How many years have you been president?
5.5.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's been a great challenge to succeed Bill Green and others. This organization was started in 1983. It's been meeting in this room since 1984. And what a lot of changes recently with our technology. Selena Valladolid is our library assistant. She makes all this possible. She's been with the library almost a year. It's great to see a young person come in, get trained, and is now fully competent to be behind that nice keyboard by herself. So thank you very much. As far, Oh, Ivy Weston, she snuck in. Ivy's title eludes me for the moment, but she's responsible for hiring all kinds of people to come in and perform. For example, at 1 o'clock, we have a classic pianist today, right? And that's due to her nice work. Thank you very much, Ivy. Ivy Weston. How about that for an example? Okay. As far as the members of this organization who are watching on Zoom, I need to make 3 comments. First, for those on Zoom, please push the mute button to turn off your sound so your private conversations stay private and your arguments stay among yourselves. Second, turn the camera off so you can retain your privacy. No fair changing clothes in front of the camera, as has happened. And third, and importantly, use the chat box to type in your questions. We'll try to take, if we have a question on the chat box, that'll be the first question we take during the question and answer session. Now let's talk about future programs real quickly. December, we do not schedule programs in December. In January, we were scheduled to have Dr. Susan Stone, CEO of the Sharp Coronado Hospital, but she's been promoted. She's going to have additional responsibilities and be responsible for the nursing corps at Sharp Grossmont, Sharp Coronado, and Sharp Chula Vista. So the speaker in January is going to be Scott Evans, who's the new regional market manager for those 3 hospitals, Sharp Grossmont, Sharp Coronado, and Sharp Chula Vista. He will be accompanied by his chief financial officer. In February, we have our port commissioner, and I might butcher his last name, Frank Uriston. Okay. In March, we have Professor Greg Daddis from San Diego State University. Dr. Daddis has the U.S. Midway Chair of Modern U.S. Military History. His presentation will be up to date and very interesting. So with that, Tom Mercer, introduce our speaker. Take it away.
The pleasure of announcing and presenting Captain Amy Bauernschmidt, skipper of the Abraham Lincoln, native of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Naval Academy graduate 1994. Of significance during that time, while she was at the Academy, all the final restrictions were taken off the women in the military, women in the Navy being on combatant ships, combatant units. So she had a full career, as you'll see, and as she'll describe, from when she graduated on. Got her wings in 1996 and flew MH-60s throughout her whole career. A lot of time on Nimitz-class carriers. One battle group tour as an aide of Car Group 7, which a few of the people have some here in the room have some experience with. Strike Group 7th on the Kitty Hawk. All the rest of her time on about 5 of the Nimitz-class carriers. Along the line, after extensive time, a lot of her helo time, of course, was on destroyers. So ship handling time, a lot closer to that than a lot of us get with regard to good ship handling experience. Got Naval War College in there, got a tour, the joint tour, required joint tour in J6. Actually had a tour of some time at the Secretary of State's office with working global issues with woman advancements. And she might want to describe that. In any case, then, of course, the drafted, selected by the director of naval reactors to go through the entire aviator nuclear power program, which includes, as many of you know, over a year, plus some time at back at naval reactors, learning the plant, in this case, the Nimitz-class plant. As you know, the entire carrier force now is nuclear powered. 10 Nimitz class carriers. Abraham Lincoln was the 5th of the class, and now one of the Ford class, which is finally deployed. So 11 nuclear powered carriers makes up the carrier force. After nuclear power training, Amy was the XO of Lincoln, which often happens, very convenient. Then went away for a deep draft on an LPD, USS San Diego, and then back as command of the Lincoln since last May for a 3-year tour, the best job in the Navy. So without further ado, Captain Amy Bauernschmidt.
Thank you very much, everyone. Good morning. This is a pretty intimidating room, so no expectations to live up to here. So what I think I'm going to do is talk a little bit about deployment, some things that have changed, some things that are the same, and then if we want to get into a little bit of leadership or any other of my tours, I am happy to talk about all of that. So we will start with deployment. Abraham Lincoln left on January 2nd of this year. We came back in August. This was my 7th deployment, and what I'd like to do is kind of give you a little bit of background on my overall deployments in the Navy, which will give a little bit of context to some of the things I'm going to talk about on this most recent deployment. This was my 7th, as I said. 6 of them have been departing from the West Coast. 1 departed from the East Coast when I was on the George H.W. Bush on her inaugural deployment. Of those, 3 of my deployments went to the 5th Fleet Area of Operations, which is the Persian Gulf. So time in and around the Persian Gulf, Gulf of Oman. Oh man, that was a weird little thing that just happened. We're good. All right. The other 4 of my deployments spent time exactly here, maybe a little bit zoomed out from here, but with what we call the 7th Fleet Area of Operations, which really covers the international date line from over on this side somewhere to kind of about halfway across the room off that screen over to about India. So that's really where I've spent kind of the majority of my time, which I think can be a little bit unique for some of the officers that are in the Navy now. With the time that we spent over in Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of folks have most of their experience over towards the Persian Gulf. So that's a little bit about how I approach this most recent deployment. We also had a very interesting geopolitical situation happening while we were deployed. Shortly after we got there, we had the F-35 crash from the Vinson, the unfortunate incident. Thankfully, we didn't lose anyone. We had almost 20 ballistic missile launches from North Korea just while we were there. I think they're over 60 for the year so far, which is an absolutely astronomical number. While North Korea has routinely launched various ballistic missiles, the quantity in 2022 has been something completely unprecedented from years past. We also had Russia-Ukraine going on. And even though that was very active on the East Coast, the Russians kept up their normal battle rhythm and their normal events on the West Coast as well. So we were very much watching the Russian ships and submarines in the Pacific, and many of their operations continued as normal, which often for them includes a summer exercise anywhere between kind of their Pacific coast all the way over to Hawaii. And we saw that again last summer. There was also 4 congressional delegation visits to Taiwan while we were over there and deployed, including Senator Graham and Speaker Pelosi. Some somewhat high-profile people certainly raising tensions in the area while we were deployed and underway. China also visited quite a few Pacific islands, not all of the ones that we see on here, but really kind of grouping out sort of between Guam, kind of coming down in here in Malaysia, outside of where we've operated in the past. They spent some time on the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Tonga, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, and Timor-Leste. All islands maybe from World War II that sound familiar, depending on how much history reading you do. They were trying to court those islands and those nations to start building up infrastructure. Shortly thereafter, the US had been working sort of on the same islands, and we came in again after China left many of those islands and sort of tried to reinvigorate some of our presence in those locations as well. And as you can imagine, everyone is very interested in some of those islands because it will be a big logistics, those will be logistics centers, those small islands, if anything were to get a little more tense and interesting in the Pacific. So that was also occurring. You probably saw in the news, China had one of their aircraft carriers underway for quite a bit of time while we were out there, and we spent some time very close to them. There was a new Republic of Korea president elected, and the Philippines also elected a new president at the time. POTUS visited Japan and Korea. There was a Shangri-La dialogues that go on in Singapore. And then we ended up our time on deployment doing the Rim of the Pacific exercise with 43 other ships, 26 other nations, the largest maritime exercise that the world has. So we were really posturing, kind of, if you really look at that entire list, we were posturing against 3 different countries. We were posturing and being able to respond to China, North Korea, or Russia most of the time that we were over there. So every time I have done one of these 4 deployments kind of in this part of the world, it has looked very different from the prior deployment. When we showed up on deployment towards the middle of January, we pretty much left on January 2nd, got the air wing on board in about 2 days, made sure they were current, and then turned west and gave her all she got until we got across the Pacific, met up with the Vincent and started conducting operations. And in that time, I completely forgot where I was going with that. Where was I going with that? I don't know, it doesn't matter. We'll figure it out. I'll come back to it at some point. So while our deployment looked pretty normal in terms of the number of flight hours we flew, the number of sorties we flew, the number of days we were underway, exactly where we operated was pretty different than most of the deployments I've participated in while we were trying to balance both China, Russia, and North Korea. We also had a couple of firsts while we were out there. And that by that, I mean working with the F-35s from the Marine Corps. This was only the second F-35 deployment and the first one for the United States Marine Corps. So integrating them into our air wing, while Marine Corps F-18 squadrons have long, for decades, been incorporated into our air wings. This was the first time we had a Marine Corps F-35 squadron. And it was only the second deployment of the CMB-22, which is the new logistics aircraft for the aircraft carrier. So we were kind of working through some of the challenges that new airframes bring, with new supply chains, with new personnel. It's never a one-for-one exchange. There was a lot to work through there. And then, of course, it was during the time of COVID still. When we left here in January, we were all still in masks. And we stayed in masks until about 27 days underway, when we had kind of created a bubble and had kind of let normal things that run through ships kind of run through. And by the time we'd kind of gotten through the first portion of deployment, people were starting to talk again about port visits, about opening up, whether it was our US bases from Okinawa and Singapore to Guam to Yokosuka or other places for ships to visit. We had a fairly normal looking deployment. And I think it was the first one on the West Coast that looked like a normal deployment from port visits. While the aircraft carrier only visited one true, what I call true port visit. I'll talk about that in a second. Our surface ships, quite frankly, we had 3 surface ships that spent quite a bit of time all the way over in the Bahrain area, but they did port visits up and down from all different parts of Australia and New Zealand through some of the smaller islands that I discussed earlier that China had visited, all the way up to northern Japan. We ended up going to Guam initially in March, which is actually just a great port visit for the sailors because they get a little bit more liberty because it's the United States. Then we also had the opportunity to go to Manila, to the Philippines, which was our first true West Coast port visit since COVID onset. Then we visited Yokosuka, which I enjoyed just having been stationed there for a couple of years and then, discussing with the sailors to get up to Tokyo and really enjoy some time up there, and they did. And then around RIMPAC, we do a very long port visit in the beginning to do a lot of interactions with the other nations and make sure that we've got a good solid foundation for all the operations we're going to do. So it was about a 12-day, 13-day port visit in Hawaii. So the sailors were very poor by the end of that. And then we ended up within about another 2 days at the end before we actually were able to do a Tiger cruise and unloaded about 712 civilians, moms, dads, brothers, sisters, best friends, and brought them from Hawaii back with us, which was the first Tiger cruise that had been done in quite a while too since COVID. As a part of some of those port visits, we also had to do mass testing. It is a very touchy subject, when and how you test and what information you either share or do not share. But there's also, as you can imagine, bringing a large ship like that into whatever size city you're going to. There were some concerns from local populations about what was coming in. What was kind of interesting about that is what we found is, young, fairly healthy folks. We left 100% deployed. We ended up over 90% boosted. So we were 100% vaccinated when we left. We ended up around Yokosuka, which was the May timeframe, about 90% boosted. For most of deployment, we hovered between 75 and 80% boosted. We still had this very low grade sort of positivity rate that we didn't even realize we always had until we did some of this testing, because people were not symptomatic. And so I couldn't tell you exactly how many folks on the ship may or may not have had COVID over the course of deployment, but I can tell you there was this kind of this low level, I'm talking about 1% of the crew, that I think, my guess, may have been positive, kind of underlying most of the deployment. We maintained all of our same COVID protocols the entire deployment. We had separate berthings, we had all of the testing supplies we needed, but it was it was definitely a transitional deployment where we left very much in a COVID environment, came home to something that was less of a COVID environment. Okay, so what did we do while we were deployed over here? We're really doing what we call presence operations. And so we're really looking at some of the bullies in the backyard, whether it's China or North Korea or Russia, and trying to be non-escalatory, but very much trying to kind of dominate the area. There's typically, depending on the day and the time, we've routinely only had, it's in the news, one carrier kind of operating in this area at a time. This is an incredibly large area to operate around. From whether you were operating not far off, kind of in between the Philippines and Taiwan, kind of up in this area, over to Guam for a port visit, you're talking about, 3 days or so of transiting, and then 3 days back, plus a port visit. You're off station, if that's where you were stationed, for quite a bit of time. If you're operating down sort of in this area, just south of Palawan, just south of the Spratly Islands, in order to get up kind of through some of these straits and back out up here, you're talking about 4 or 5 days of transiting, depending on exactly which route you took and exactly what you were doing. So these are not short transit times, which I think everyone is still trying to wrap their head around when staffs are tasking ships, because they're used to the Persian Gulf, which was much smaller and a much more concentrated area. So I think one of the things we're still wrapping our brain around is exactly what we want, how we want to balance this non-escalatory yet dominating posture. One of the other things, if I just talked about all those days, that becomes very challenging is logistics. And so we talked about the various islands. We talked about where some of our logistics come from. They're doing a lot of great work about trying to figure out how to zone out or come up with different ways to tackle the logistics problem. But if you were expected to be up north and you ended up south, it's the ship might not be able to get to you. Most of our supply ships travel at much slower speeds, around 16 knots. It takes them, if it takes us 4 or 5 days, it's going to take them 6 days. And depending on how many ships they're supporting, it is a true challenge to ensure that we have logistics set up for all of the assets that we are supporting in theater. We did an incredible amount of work with partner nations. And so while that probably comes as no surprise to folks that have, routinely operated in this area or read about operations in this area, we spent a lot of time working with the Japanese, But we also had the Koreans, we also had Australia and New Zealand, UK, France. And then even as we went over to the Rim of the Pacific exercise in the Hawaiian operating area, I think we grabbed about 12 ships that we came with us. Several of those nations have their own logistics ships now. So we did a lot of interchanging of logistics ships. We went alongside the Australian oilers as they came alongside. We even had one do an approach on the carrier, because we can also give gas to surface ships as well as taking on JP5. I can give them gas to run their ships. So we did a lot. We did a lot of photo exercises to kind of show that we were out there. I think we did a total of 7. The last one being Rim of the Pacific, which was, I think, 43 ships, which was an all-day event to do a photo X with 43 ships. No kidding. We started lining up at 6 in the morning. We didn't take the photo until about 16:30 that afternoon. It is a long day, because as you can imagine, if there's 6 or 7 ships in line and you're spaced out at about 5 miles per ship, in order to close all that down, it takes all day. And so it was a long day on the bridge. It allowed me to get through all my end of deployment awards though. So it made the sailors happy because they all got their awards before deployment actually ended. You know, in addition to quite a bit of time we spent somewhat centrally located to be able to respond to any of the 3 countries that we were worried about, we also participated in a lot of long-range maritime strikes. And so a lot of time that we spent looking at different ways to tackle problems depending on where you wanted to position ships, and having discussions about, again, what it looks like to dominate while not being escalatory either now or in the future. You can find all of this online, so I don't think I'm saying anything that is verboten. Doing operations in the Yellow Sea in between China and North Korea is something that the US has participated in. Again, watching Russia doing their normal summer exercises, bringing ships closer to Hawaii on a more routine basis while they do it. They've kind of extended their timelines. And then China flying a lot of high altitude balloons that we're kind of still trying to wrap our head around exactly what that means and what those balloons represent. But they're pretty amazing. If you Google them, you will find these pretty incredible pictures, and they can be up at 50, 60,000 feet. And you swear when you're looking at it, it looks like they're kind of right outside your doorstep. So sort of a Goodyear blimp like we just had over the ship, but a little more silver and a little more vertical vice horizontal. April through September, you know, Japan has been very active. So not only did they support us in our entire time over there, but I think they scrambled jets on the order of almost 500 times just in the couple of months of this year in order to intercept both Chinese and Russian aircraft. And that was also around the time that CV-16, one of the Chinese aircraft carriers, was out and operating in the area. So the response tether with these kinds of time speed distances is an absolute challenge. Okay, that was pretty much deployment. One of the other things that can be challenging while you're talking about kind of operations over there and these presence operations is how do you explain this to all your sailors? I think it was easy when we were in Iraq and Afghanistan to launch jets. They were full of bombs. We would often drop the bombs. They would come back. They would land without the bombs. They would see on the news the effects of where the ordnance went, and they could put it all together. It was certainly much more challenging when you're over here doing presence operations. And so this is sort of my segue between deployment to a little bit of leadership. When I go into INDOC each week, the first thing I hit on with all of my sailors is that what they do matters and their hard work makes a difference. Each and every time we get underway, getting underway on time, being where we need to be absolutely matters and makes a difference. The news helped out a lot actually when we were over here. So we download, and for those that are retired, you certainly have the ability to access Shinfo clips. Shinfo clips is usually a set of 35 to 40 news articles put together by the Navy's one-star public affairs team in Washington, D.C. They email it out each day, and we post it online for all of the sailors to read. The news articles are not, I mean, you can find them anywhere. It's Washington Post, New York Times, Bloomberg, Associated Press, Stars and Stripes, Coronado Eagle. Like it's local papers in addition to all the national papers, Asia Times. But I would often go up, I would try to do at least once a week, even on the announcing system, pull a couple of those nuggets off. It would discuss things like the 3 times that the Philippines took China to International Maritime Court in the somewhat recent past, and discussions about, it was really Coast Guard, Chinese Coast Guard ships harassing the Philippines, moving in to take their natural resources and what that meant. So I bring up some of these articles and I would look at the sailors and I would, hey, what you do matters, your hard work makes a difference. So what is this do thing that we do? And I often come over and the first place I go to, I draw them this. It does not look quite like this. I ask them to please forgive me for my drawings, but I come over the Spratly Islands and we start talking about the Spratly Islands. And I ask them who's ever lived sort of on the Gulf Coast and those wonderful white sandy beaches with that beautiful blue ocean at high tide. And then at low tide, you have that wonderful white sandy beach, a little bit more of it, some blue water, a sand dune, and then more blue water. And usually a bunch of hands go up. Yep, I've seen that. I go, okay, well, that's the Spratly Islands. Even today, before I came in here, I pulled up on my phone the Spratly Islands, and you won't really see islands yet per se, even on Google Maps. You will see lighter colors of blue, maybe a little bit of beige showing land, but for the most part, you only see those islands during low tide. Well, China, much like they consider Taiwan theirs, is very interested in the Spratly Islands for quite a few reasons. And so what China has done in the past is literally shown up with dirt, dumped it on top of these islands during low tide, built an outhouse, put a flag there and said, it's ours. Now, what happens when you do that? And if it is recognized as theirs, now they have territorial seas and airspace out to 12 nautical miles. They have a contiguous zone and an economic exclusive zone out to 200 nautical miles. There are also quite a few rules, all at the International Maritime Courts, where depending on how far apart these islands are, international maritime law dictates whether you have that territorial seas and airspace just around your island, or whether you can make this interesting amorphous blob kind of connecting together islands. And what that can look like, it can either give you a space between islands to thread through for both any commercial traffic or military traffic, or they could end up encompassing an entire area. And especially in the Spratlys, it can take over quite a bit of this area. Oh, by the way, why do my sailors care? And this is actually where last year, when we had all the ships sitting off the coast of Los Angeles trying to get in before Christmas, came in handy as I was trying to explain this to the sailors in January. Hey, who couldn't get the Christmas present they wanted or whatever gadget they wanted for deployment? Invariably hands would go up. I go, yeah, I was sitting off the coast of Los Angeles because it couldn't get into port. I go, what if that ship couldn't even make it to the coast? What if that ship couldn't even get to us? You know, something on the order of close to 90% of everything that we own, absolutely everything in our lives, comes to us via the ocean, via container ships, and then into our ports, onto trains and onto trucks. A significant portion of that goes through the South China Sea. Whether you're coming from Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, above, a significant part of it will come through Hong Kong. A significant part of it will come through the South China Sea in one way, shape, or form. In addition to the Spratly Islands, there's the Parcel Islands and the Senkaku Islands, which China has, while they have not moved quite as far into those sets of islands, it is certainly on their radar. Other sets of islands that they are sort of interested in making more theirs than others. So the Philippines, like I said, have taken China to the International Maritime Court, I believe 3 times in the last couple of years, one each time. It has not really deterred China, though. So one of the things that we do during this presence ops, I will pull up these articles and talk about the fact that, hey, when we're there, just like if you wanted to go play on a piece of equipment in the playground when you were a kid, and the bully was standing in front of it, or someone, a friend was standing in front of it, maybe you thought twice about going to play on that piece of gym equipment. That's kind of how we are when we're over there, just operating, doing our normal routine operations. So that's why it's so important that we're there and that we take our turn in the barrel when our deployment comes, and that we do our maintenance to the best of our ability when it's time to do maintenance so that we can get back out operating at full capacity. Very proud to say that our Air Department team kept up 4 catapults and 4 wires for all of deployment except for 1 catapult for about 5 weeks. That is extraordinary. I know there's not a lot of context necessarily in this room, but that is absolutely extraordinary. And what it allowed us to do was stand any alerts or operate in any manner with which not only our strike group, but the Pacific leaders needed us to operate in. So I say, great. That's why you come to work every day. Now, what do you do when we come to work? And we talk about being a deterrent to armed conflict, going into armed conflict, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, or anything else our nation needs us to do. And then I usually finish with, well, how do we do that? And I talk about taking great sailors and making sure that they have the training and resources they need to do their jobs. And I go, now, how do you do that if you have the training and the resources? And I talk about professionalism, integrity, and ownership. And under professionalism, I talk about their technical discipline, their procedural knowledge, or their level of knowledge and their procedural discipline. Under integrity, I talk about them being a sailor that's known 24/7, 365 for maintaining the standard. And then under ownership, which is my favorite, I talk about knowing your job and doing your job to the utmost of your ability every day. owning the outcome of your work, not just completing the task. And I use this analogy with them. Personally, not a fan of doing laundry. I like clean laundry. I'm good at laundry in the hamper, but between the hamper and the clean laundry back in my drawers, there's a disconnect. I can get it into the washer. That's good. I can get it into the dryer. That's good, usually. Out of the dryer, back into the drawers. Sometimes it lays on top of my dresser. Sometimes it lays over the chair. And then half the time I end up wearing what I wore last week just so I don't have to put it away. I go, I accomplished the task. The task was clean laundry. Check. But did I really own the outcome of my work? No, I did not. Because if I really owned the outcome of my work, I would have folded that right away and I would have put it away. And so it typically kind of resonates with them because in their small space that they have on board the ship, and we do have quite a few sailors living on board the ship right now, they have to fold up their laundry. And they don't always like to do it based on berthing inspections. So that's a little bit about kind of what we did for deployment. That is a little bit about how I talked to some of my sailors about leadership. Since we've been back from deployment, we did a little bit of a maintenance availability, went back out again and conducted carrier qualifications for both some of the training squadrons in Texas and then for also some of the fleet replacement squadrons. So every level of pilot trying to get qualified to go out to the fleet. When we do that, I have the exact same conversation about how what they do matters and their hard work makes a difference. And we talk about, I usually pull out a couple of names. We know which pilots are going to be going immediately on deployment once they finish carrier quals because they'll get a couple extra bounces on the ship. Identify those pilots and call them out once they've completed their tasking and are heading out. So I have absolutely no doubt we're going to do some carrier qualifications coming up here before the end of the year. And some of those pilots may join Nimitz, who is leaving soon, or carriers on the East Coast that are leaving soon. Came back from that. We just finished up some more maintenance and a basketball game, but I think a bunch of people were fortunate enough to see. Team did an incredible job with the basketball game. And now we're taking, the normal kind of Thanksgiving break before we get right back at it again. Well, we are staying as the ready duty carrier. There was always a sustainment phase when you come back from deployment where if the 911 number gets called, we're the ones that go until next spring. And then we will go into a little bit longer maintenance availability, which will help facilitate some upgrades and some repairs to be that much more lethal when we go back out again. So that is really, frankly, all I was going to cover. I know we usually take a break, grab some coffee and do questions if you'd like to continue with that.
7-minute break. We reconvene at 10:45.